All right, so this is part 13, I believe, of our What Do You Want series, and the longest series I've ever taught, and had no idea it was going to be this long, but this is where I feel like we need to be. And so this is going to be the last week. I want to give you kind of a preview of what's going to happen. This is going to be the last week that we talk about Kedusha. I thought it was going to be last week, but there's a couple more things I want to mention. This is going to be the last week we talk about Kedusha specifically, but I hope that these talks on holiness, Kedusha, have filtered into your thinking process and caused you to or created a new lens, rather, for you to look at life and think through. Today, we're going to talk about markers of holiness, or markers of Kedusha. If you're in our Wednesday night group, you've already been through this, but we're gonna go through it tonight because the Father does not call us to be something without giving us parameters, guidance, markers that should be very clear. And we're going to talk about some very real biblical examples today, and then we're going to talk about how to apply those things in our lives, to our lives. So next week, we will talk about, what we're going to do is we're going to transition from kind of the identity sphere of this series, and we're going to start to transition into actual observance, which is what we started with 3 months ago or 4 months ago, however long it's been now, into actual observance. And kind of a God thing, you know, Kyle came to me a couple of weeks ago and he said, hey, I've been putting together this document, this Google Doc with all of the commandments, all of the mitzvot, and then he's hyperlinking in the document sources to all of the halakha, all of the laws and rules, it's all the things. It's incredibly exhaustive. And really incredible. It's got scripture, it's got Mishnah, it's got all the stuff. So we've been talking about how to proceed and what would be most helpful for us as a community. And so what we're going to do is next week we're going to talk again about, we're going to start with Shabbat as far as how to increase our observance, how to really start to center or improve on and centering our lives around Shabbat. I know that most of us here, it's kind of preaching to the choir. But I think some of the things we're going to talk about, a lot of it will still be helpful for even us. Again, we might be doing this. We're doing 10 o'clock every Shabbat, or most Shabbats, right, on Saturday, and that's great. But there's a whole lot more to Shabbat than just this. And if we've learned anything through the Torah and our time in Scripture, is that the more you do, the more you'll get out. You get out what you put in. And I don't want anyone that is a part of my fellowship, our fellowship, I don't want anyone to think that that this is all there is to Shabbat. Because when you take Shabbat out of this community, which is a blessing, and so many people don't have what we have, when you take Shabbat out of this and you take it into your home and into your heart and you personalize it and it becomes who you are and what you do, then it takes on a whole life of its own. And so I don't want to rob anybody of that by just thinking, oh, like you came to service, you're good. That's all you need to do for Shabbat. No, there's a whole beautiful world of Shabbat out there. So we're going to start with Shabbat. And just Shabbat is going to probably take us 6 weeks or so. And we're gonna go through. I'm gonna repeat a lesson I did a couple weeks ago on connecting Shabbat to creation in the temple, because there was a lot of information, and I want to dig into that a little bit more. And then we are going to get into the laws of Shabbat, and we're going to explain the sources that we're using. We're going to explain why we're using those sources. A little bit of history on those sources, so there's no question. Nobody can come and say, oh, well, you're just making stuff up, or you're using stuff that the rabbis made up, or whatever. Baloney. I know that most of us are past that, and anybody that follows us on social media that has that attitude probably doesn't follow us anymore either. So it's just we know kind of where we stand, and we're comfortable with that. But I want to explain the sources to you because I want you to be able to have access to them. After Shabbat, we are going to do probably the 10 Commandments is what it looks like. We're going to start there. Here's the thing. It's going to be a lot of information. Okay, I'm just prepping you. I want to prep you for a couple of weeks because I don't want you to get into it and be like, I'm overwhelmed. So be overwhelmed now so that you can get over it, okay, that you can get through it. Just understand that it's going to be a lot of information, okay? Why? Because we are not just talking about biblical context where we're reading a verse before and a verse after. We're talking about traditions of living out the commandments because that's what we said we wanted to do. We said we wanted to follow the Torah. And we go, well, how are you following the Torah? Well, we meet on Shabbat. Is that the end of our Torah observance? We want to do this. So we have to now, because we didn't grow up in this particular way, we have to now go back and look at 4,000 years of tradition and history and culture and language and all that kind of stuff. And that's what Kyle and I are doing, trying to do this work, a lot of this work for you, but we also want you to understand what it takes. So anyway, so that's kind of a precursor of what's to come. I am super duper excited. One of the sources we're going to be using, I don't have it here. I don't have my back to the camera, I'm sorry. I do. So this is just one example of one of the sources we're using. This is one. This is book 1 out of 10. There are 10 of these in the set, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. It's called Sefer HaChinuk, or the Book of Mitzvot. And so what it is, it breaks the commandments down by parsha. And every parsha, it'll give you a list of all the commandments in that parsha. It'll tell you their history, how they were observed, how they're observed today. There's a gobload of commentary and all this kind of stuff. So I'm sure nobody wants to go out and buy and study this 10-volume set, but if you'd like to, do it. It's awesome. It's fantastic. And but this is some of the stuff that Kyle and I will be using to go through that. So you wanted it, you got it. All right. So for today, we are going to be, I'm just going to pull this over here and frame a little bit. We're going to piggyback off of what we talked about last week. I didn't redraw this and rewrite it because, frankly, I couldn't be bothered. But we're talking, in honesty, great. So we're piggybacking off of last week where we talked about the 10 sanctities, okay, the 10 spheres, levels, whatever of Kedusha. I don't like to think about these in terms of levels. I've heard a lot of preaching about levels, like, oh, we're going to a new level. We're going, new level, new devil, deeper and higher and all this kind of stuff. I don't know that I like that kind of terminology because it assumes that one level is better than the last one. And in a way, you could say that that's true because as I move closer to here, I'm getting closer to the presence of Hashem. But that's a really narrow view of where God lives and who God is. The scripture tells us that the whole earth is God's and filled with his glory. So if we think that God is just here and I have to be in a certain geographic location, or that I have to be like the Kohen Gadol, or in our context, that I can only really access the full presence of God when I'm standing at an altar where the lights are dimmed and there's music playing, right? So we have a context too, and our context is not much different than this in some of those ways. We still maybe sometimes feel like we have to be in the right setting, in the right mood, in the right whatever, in order to really sense and feel and connect with the presence of Hashem. And that's just not true. That's our limited view of who God is and where he is. The truth is that, those backsliders that we all have known from church that would rather be out fishing than in church on Sunday morning, the truth is they're probably closer to God than we are in a lot of ways. So, I don't like to think of it in terms of levels because as we talked about last week, there are people that live in this sphere that Hashem has provided everything that they need. access, provision, protection, everything is beautiful for the people that live in this sphere and subsequently in each one. And as I've said very, very much, with more access comes more restriction, right? And you've heard me say that for a couple of years now. This is why. Hopefully some of the things that I've been saying, just kind of one-offs over the last several months, couple of years, now are starting to kind of come together because this is the context that I'm using. I also want to make a comment on something that I got some feedback afterwards last week that was really good. And I think it was actually Kyle that was mentioning. He said, I'm working through some of this stuff with you in my head. What's important to remember is that when you move in a level of Kedusha, so I didn't say up, when you move in a level of Kedusha, when you increase your Kedusha, you increase your access, but you also increase your restriction. Here's the thing about things that, and we've taught this before, that attain a certain level of Kedusha is that they cannot then be used in a lesser sphere of Kedusha. So something I like talking about is, we're going to talk about today, is the priest garments. And the priest garments can only be used for priestly service. Only. We like, yeah, duh. But that also works for things like the fire pans, the utensils and instruments in the tabernacle. It also, in the temple, it also works for the people. Once the Kohen has this level of Kedusha, he can't go back and do other things because once you're there, you're there. But the beautiful thing about Kedusha, we read in the Torah how if something is tameh, is unclean, right? Then that unclean status is contagious. So if this chair is unclean and I sit in it, I become unclean. The way that the Torah talks about purity is that it's contagious, right? This is the whole reason why there's such a day called Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur is not about cleaning you and me. Yom Kippur is about cleaning the house. Why is it important to clean the house? Because impurity is contagious. And we contract impurity. The Israelites would contract impurity all throughout their living, right? Because they were farmers and agriculturalists. They were agrarian mostly. And so impurity was everywhere and just as a part of life. Again, impure doesn't mean sin always. Really, very little. But you come in impure, and as much as you try to clean yourself, you put your impurity on the house where God lives. And so once a year, the house has to be cleaned. The altar has to be cleaned. Thus, Yom Kippur, right? Now, we have adapted Yom Kippur to cleaning us because we serve as the house now. And so, in a way, but we have to understand what the purpose was initially. So, not only is impurity contagious, but Kedusha is contagious. Because the Torah also tells us that if something is holy and it touches something, that thing becomes holy. So the goal then, and again, we've talked about this before, but now hopefully with my beautiful illustration, it's a little easier to see. Once you enter, you may live in a walled city, okay? But you have to come up to the temple for Shlosh Regalim, the pilgrimage feasts, right? Well, you are entering a higher level of Kedusha. But you don't live there, right? Specific times, because Kedusha is time-dependent, place-dependent many times. You can't go back to that. You can't go down again in lesser degrees of holiness. What's the teaching there? What's the lesson there? The lesson there is whenever you attain a new level of holiness, of Kedusha, of access, you are supposed to then go back to where you came from and raise that place to the same level of Kedusha as where you came from, if that makes sense, okay? So, we're going to read from the Mishnah this morning. This is from Tractate Midot, chapter 1, verse 6. We've read from here several times in our Wednesday night, so if you've been involved in that, this should sound familiar. For those of you that have not heard this, you're going to be super confused, but don't worry, I'll break it down. Is it chilly in here? A little bit? Okay. No, yes, no. Okay, I'm just making sure. Okay. Depends on your state in life, I guess. All right, so this is from Midot 1:6. It tells us that there were 4 chambers in Beit HaMoked. Okay, Beit HaMoked is a really important place that we'll talk about. There were 4 chambers in Beit HaMoked, like side rooms that open to a drawing room, 2 in the sanctified area and 2 in the unsanctified area. And the ends of beams separated the sanctified area from the unsanctified area. And what was their function? The southwestern one was the chamber of the sacrificial lambs. The southeastern one was the chamber of the makers of lechem hapanim. What is lechem hapanim? Showbread is the way King James, the bread of faces, or the bread of the presence, right? The northeastern one, in it, the Hasmoneans stored the stones of the altar. What stones of the altar are we talking about? Does anybody remember? Yeah, the Maccabees, the ones that Antiochus, that we read about in Hanukkah, when the Greeks set up an idol on the altar and sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. That altar that was defiled, the Maccabees tells us that when they dismantled that altar, they put the stones in a safe place, and they waited for a prophet to come to tell them what to do with it. Now, that's a fascinating lesson in Kedusha. We don't even think about it. If you've ever read that, you might have wondered, like, well, yeah, but there are priests. The Maccabees themselves are priests. Why would they not know what to do with the altar? And, BTW, what's the big deal? If it has become unclean, why not just throw it out? Because you don't want it anywhere inside the temple. Why wouldn't you throw out the stones of the altar? Because they have a Kedusha. Even though they've become unclean, they've become contaminated, they have a Kedusha, the altar. We talked about last week the altar. Ezrat Nashim, Ezrat Israel, Ezrat Kohanim, and then the space between the altar and the porch, right? It has a Kedusha. So you can't take it out and just throw it out anywhere. It doesn't work like that. And so the Maccabean priests were caught between, well, what do we do? How do we handle this? So they set it aside, the stones of the altar, until someone could come and tell them how to dispose of it correctly, all right? What to do with it. It's a matter of Kedusha and how to treat holy things correctly, okay? Next, it says the northwestern chamber we're talking about, through it they would descend to the place of immersion. All right, so what are we talking about and why is this important? We're talking about markers of holiness, right? Boy, I really could have used the tables today. All right, so we're talking about the markers of holiness. Where do I need to be? Oops. You just need me to stand in one place. All right. Wait, let me get up here because I tell you what, let me do it like this. This will be my spot, okay? All right. We're all good? It's professional production here. All right. So, temple building, right? Or temple building. You have north, south, east, and west. Just so it's important to always, make sure we are acclimating ourselves to where we are, okay? So we have this building called Beit HaMoked, okay? Well, what is that? Beit HaMoked, this is the temple building. The area surrounding the temple building is known as the Azarah, okay? That's an important vocabulary word you need to know, the Azarah. Today, we read in the Parsha this week about the building of the tabernacle, right? We see this and we go, that doesn't look anything like the tabernacle, right? But what we have to understand is that the tabernacle in the wilderness represented this area of the temple, what we call today the Azarah, okay? This would have been the courtyard. Don't think about this. Don't think about this area here where the temple building stood. Now, there's some scholarship coming out that possibly the tabernacle in the wilderness did have these corner and side buildings for some important reasons that it's too nerdy to get into right now. But this is what is represented in the temple wilderness, okay? This is the Nicanor gate in the second temple. It would have been the front opening to the courtyard. The curtains would have gone around here, okay? Second temple, Beit HaMoked, okay? This one is called Beit HaNitzotz, or the house of the spark, or house of the hearth. It's called the house of the hearth because in it there was a large fireplace. In this side, there was a large fireplace, and it was the priest's dorm room. There were stacks of bunk beds, several stories high, that the priest would sleep and eat in here, in this side of this room. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get around everybody, okay? Beit HaNitzotz. This room, this is called Beit Avtinas. Beit Avtinas. In this section here was the kior, or the place of washing, right? The brazen laver is what we would call it. The brazen laver. Now, if you're thinking through this and you remember what the tabernacle looked like, you might go, okay, but I've seen pictures of the tabernacle and even pictures that I've drawn. And when you have the tabernacle, you have the gate, or you have the opening. Then you have the laver. Then you have the altar, right? And you go, well, shouldn't the laver be here? The Torah tells us that the laver is to be placed south of the altar, okay? And that's really all. There's not a whole lot of details. Well, where the laver is placed in this room, it is about right here. So it is between the gate and the altar. So it is still within the parameters. It's just not in the same room necessarily, okay? In this part of Beit Avtinas is where the Sanhedrin met. Now think about this. The Sanhedrin, how much power do they have? Well, they have court in the temple building. That's fairly powerful, right? Not super far, a stone's throw from the altar. I mean, pretty big deal. You walk out of this is called the room is called Palhedron. You walk out of the Palhedron, and you walk out with your chest puffed out because you're a big deal. Okay, so this is Beit Avtinas. Then on this corner is this building is called Beit Otzrot, all right, or the house Beit Otzrot. So we have these four corner buildings. So this part of Midot is talking about this one right here, Beit HaMoked, okay? And it says that there were 4 chambers inside. And then it starts talking about 2 open to the sanctified area and 2 open to the unsanctified area. And we're like, what does that mean, right? And then it tells us that there were markers to tell you which one was where. So here's teaching that the temple gives us. This area, the Azarah, has a higher level of Kedusha than this little raised platform right here. Those of you that are on Wednesday nights, what's this called? Do you remember? Hard word to say? The Chayil. Very good. This is the Chayil, right? Outside of here is the little wall called the what? Soreg. Man, y'all are great. So the little wall out here called the Soreg. We talked about the Soreg last week. Then you go up in Kedusha and you go up in elevation to the Chayil. Okay? So what you have here basically is you have 2 rooms. One has a door that opens to the Azarah, which is a really holy place. One has a door that opens to the Chayil. So the things in this half of the room are holier than the things in this half of the room. Does that make? Because it depends on where the door opens up to. If you are open to a higher level of Kedusha, then the things inside of that room take on that level of Kedusha. Does that make sense, or is that clear as mud? Yep. Okay, good. We have other buildings. We have other buildings in here, like in this area, that the doors only open to the Chayil. So they are not affected by the Azarah's Kedusha, because Kedusha is contagious, remember? Now, what would it be as a priest? How in the world would you know which level you were in or where you were? There were markers all over the temple, little knobs that stuck out on the side of the wall that were markers. And we even think that there might have been a change in the tile, like a strip of different tile on the floor, saying, hey, you're crossing over. Because if you think about this, the Azarah here, and this door opens to the Azarah. So this room has the same Kedusha as the Azarah. And so if you walk over here around in this colonnade under this hallway and you don't know where you are, you might get shot in the head by a Levitical archer because you're not allowed to be there, or whatever. Or you might get lashes or whatever the case may be. So this idea that Kedusha is contagious. And God gave in the temple clear markers so you would know you're trespassing. This place is not for you, or you are not for it, okay? So this is a place marker. It's interesting. We were talking Wednesday night about holiness, holiness churches. Some of you know what I'm talking about when I say a holiness church. They come in different forms and fashions. Most denominations have a kind of regular version of their denomination, then they have a holiness version. And the regular denomination is for the slackers, and the holiness version is for the people that are really serious about what they're doing. But just a couple of examples, like I know for sure in Pentecostalism, you have Pentecostals, right? Which have their standards and do their thing. But then you have apostolics, or apostolics, as they're called out in the country. And apostolics are, they're like Pentecostals on steroids, right? And so that's a holiness movement within inside the Pentecostal denomination. It's a holiness movement that came out of that because that religion wasn't, or that denomination wasn't strict enough in some ways, right? If you can imagine. I know in the black church you have several holiness movements that came out of different denominations. If you've ever been to a Church of God in Christ, for instance, you'll see the missionaries will wear almost what it looks like a nun's outfit. It'll be all black or all white. And the cool thing about these is that what are they doing? They are pursuing Kedusha. Because what are they doing? The apostolics said, your Pentecostals say, like, well, you can't, grow you can't cut your hair, you got to wear this and, and that and whatever and blah, blah. And they said, well, that's not restrictive enough to set us apart, right? I know there's a lot of baggage. We might laugh at a lot of stuff. I've been to churches before, ministered in churches before where they baptize you, you come out, and you're talking in tongues, whatever, and if you came in dressed a certain way, you leave dressed like a Pentecostal. They have clothes there for people that come in and are not dressed right because of the standard. So we may, joke and laugh about some of that. It may seem silly, but the underlying idea is this idea. And so let's give credit and let's have appreciation for what some of these things are. They are not doing it in a temple context or in a Torah or a commandment, a mitzvah context, but it is still the same heart that they understand that holiness equals restriction, right? The challenge or the problem with not doing it based on the Torah as a tavnit or a blueprint is that you come out with all kind of wacky stuff. You come out with things about hair not being able to be cut. For ladies, or hair cut a particular way. For men, you can't have it on your neck. You can't have, all the things. Sleeves have to be down to here, even when you're cutting grass in 115-degree weather in the summer. Like, we come out with some stuff, right? That's okay. But the heart behind it is this restriction, okay? So next I want to talk about markers in time. And I wanted to have all this on the screen. I didn't get to it. I'm sorry. There's this archaeological find digging around the walls of the Temple Mount this thing called the trumpeting stone that was found. And if you're interested in this, I'm not going to force feed you, but if you're interested in it, go online and Google the trumpeting stone. And it's fascinating. What it is on the southwest corner, so if we're looking at the temple model, on the southwest corner, right, which would be over here, the wall of the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. Sorry. Stop moving. Okay. I'm trying to help you. The wall of the southwest corner, so you'd have been up here somewhere, right? And just as a geographical reference, what valley is right over here? The Kidron Valley, and the Mount of Olives is across from that, right? So below the Temple Mount, you have the city of David that comes down kind of to a point, and then Jerusalem is all over here, right? The town or suburb of Bethesda is up here, and then Jerusalem kind of wraps around the Temple Mount like this, okay? So you have a trumpeting stone, and what it is it's a stone in the top part of the wall that has a notch cut out of it for a priest to stand. And at the end of every Friday, the priest would come up and they would blow a trumpet so that all of Jerusalem could hear. And they were marking that Shabbat is on the way. So start to wrap up all your stuff. There would be 3 blasts, and then a little bit later, there would be 3 more blasts to say, that's it. You had your warning, we're done. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great if, like, towards Friday afternoon, all of a sudden there was a trumpet blast that went out and everybody knew, like, you see how it was a part of their rhythm? It's a part of their life and their rhythm, and they're marking time with the trumpet blast. And so the on the stone, there's this inscription, and it basically says something like, to the place of trumpeting to mark between the holy and the common. And I think that's beautiful. It's beautiful because there's a verse in Ezekiel that tells us, in chapter 44, verse 23, it says, and they shall teach my people, this is speaking of the priests, but I would say it also works for the house as well. They're to teach my people the difference between holy and common, but to cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. The job of a Kohen, the job of a priest, and I would even say that the job of any of us who know, is to teach people the difference between holy and common, between clean and unclean. And so they would trumpet the onset of the Shabbat. If you could just close your eyes and imagine what it would have been like being in Jerusalem and the hustle and bustle of everybody getting prepared for Shabbat, and you're buying bread for Kedusha, or you're buying wine, or you're buying flowers to take home to set the table, or you're making preparations, whatever, and all of a sudden you hear that trumpet wail out over the city. I mean, it just gives me goosebumps. And you know that the end is coming. You've got probably an hour or so before that last 3 blasts come, and that's it. And you have marked the beginning of Shabbat, right? And they don't do, what's that? Yeah, we got group text. That's right. And you got calendars that you can download on your phone that it'll say 5 minutes till candlelighting, 3 minutes till candlelighting, right? So yes, that's a beautiful point. In our community, in our little community, it's not Jerusalem, right? And we're not in the market together trying to get stuff together, but we have done the same thing. We have created a marker for Shabbat, right? And it comes in the form of a group text. Hey, Baruch Hashem, we have that. But I want you to understand what we're doing. We're not doing something so dissimilar to what was done 2,000 years ago. Markers in time. The beautiful thing about this trumpeting stone is that at the end of Shabbat, because the job of the priest is to mark the common from the holy. At the end of Shabbat, right after the sunset, and you could see 3 stars in the sky, the priest would ascend up to the trumpeting stone and blow again. Because you see, it's just as important to mark the end of Shabbat and to separate it from the common days that come before it as it was to mark its beginning, right? So these sounds, these things in time. Now what we need to add to our group text is a Shavua Tov, right? For the beginning of the new week, because we're closing out Shabbat, right? Christian would be in charge of that? No. No. But what do we do? What do we do at the beginning of Shabbat? We do Kedusha, right? Which comes from Kadosh, setting it apart as holy. What do we do at the end of Shabbat? We do Havdalah, which means separation, right? We're separating, and there's a prayer that we pray at the end of Shabbat, a blessing, and that blessing includes the phrase to separate the holy from the common, which is the same thing that was on the trumpeting stone that was the job of the priest, which comes from Ezekiel 44. Isn't that beautiful? But it's about marking. It's about marking things, okay? And so we have these sanctified areas in the temple that are marked. We have sanctification in time that is marked. And those things are very, very important. Lastly, today, a little bit shorter today, we're going to talk about the priest's clothing. And I want to read a couple of quotes from you, or for you rather. Okay. So this is from Ezekiel 44 again. And it says, "And it shall be whenever they enter the gates of the inner court," okay, the inner court, "that they shall put on linen garments. No wool shall come upon them while they minister within the gates of the inner court or within the house. They shall have linen turbans on their heads." That means their heads are covered. "And linen trousers on their bodies, and they shall not clothe themselves with anything that causes sweat." So, where should I be for this? I know, I'm killing you. Okay, I know you do. Thank you. When they enter the inner court, okay, which part are they entering? Where they're Kohanim, they're priests that are coming for service. So the Mishnah tells us that what would happen is that they would come in, actually this way. They would come in, and who did we say meets here? The Sanhedrin, right? The Kohanim would come in, and they would have to show themselves to the Sanhedrin and certify that they were clean, that they're good, they're fit or kosher to serve. Okay, that's what kosher means. It just means fit. They were kosher to serve. Once they were approved by the Sanhedrin, then they would come into this room, which, what did we say was in this room? Do you remember? The laver, right? The kior, they would come in and they would wash their hands and feet, and they would change their clothes. They would take off their civies, so to speak, and they would put on their linen garments and their linen turban. They would dress for priestly service. Then they could come in and they could do whatever service they were given for that day or for that time. It says that they shall wear linen, and they shall not wear anything that causes them to sweat. So some of you may have heard the discussion or have debated or heard the debate on the Torah. There's a there's a commandment not to wear clothes, not to wear wool and linen mixed, right? You guys know the commandment I'm talking about? And man, it gets a lot of play in some Hebrew root circles because there's frequencies that conflict and stuff. And there may be. Probably everything is made of frequencies as part of God's design. So I don't have a problem with that. The thing is, though, when we say, well, God is commanding us not to mix our clothing, well, then what do we do about everything that we wear today is mixed, unless you want to start wearing wool all the time or linen all the time, neither of which is real practical. The context for that commandment is that is a commandment for the priesthood, that when they go into the holy place, they are not to wear garments that are mixed with linen and wool, because they are serving in the holy place. Outside of that, wear whatever the heck you want. But when you come in to serve in the holy place, only linen. because wool has a tendency to cause you to sweat, especially if you're in Jerusalem in the heat of the day, right? It causes you to sweat, and that was a no-no. And so linen has a natural wicking effect as well. And so it's a priestly commandment. This commandment is not for all Israel. It is a priestly commandment, okay? And so it goes on to say, when they go out to the outer court, which is, outside, they take off their garments in which they have ministered, leave them in the holy chambers, and put on other garments, and in their holy garments they shall not sanctify or bless or minister to the people. So when the priests serve, they are to be wearing a certain garment. When they get done serving, they are to leave their garments in, it says, the holy chamber. So we know that the holy chamber is going to be one of these 4 internal rooms, or chambers, because they're connected to the holy place. They leave them there, change back into their regular clothes, then they can go out and mingle with the people, because listen, everybody wants to talk to the priest after service, right? Or the pastor, or the whatever. So much so that some pastors have an entourage that protect them after the service. You gotta stay away. He's the holy man of God. Whatever. But he's really not. He hadn't changed his clothes, so it's fine. But see, we read some of the context, but we don't read all of the context. If you've ever called your preacher, pastor, the holy man of God, did he change his clothes before he got up to teach? See what I'm saying? You go, oh, well, you're being really belligerent about that. No, I'm just saying we have to understand the source of where these things come from, and then we are less likely to get crazy, wacky stuff that we say and believe later on. We have a better foundation, and it creates an identity of who we are, right? And so this goes on in Ezekiel, or another translation of Ezekiel. It says that when they come to the gates of the inner courtyard, they shall wear linen clothes. Wool shall not be upon them when they serve inside the gates of the inner courtyard within. See? No wool. Linen turbans will be on their head, and linen breeches on their loins. They shall not gird themselves where one perspires. When they go out to the outer courtyard, then they shall remove their clothes that they ministered in. It goes on then to say, and I'll end on this controversial one. It goes on to say, they shall not shave their heads. Okay? Nor shall they let them or allow them to grow wild. So somewhere in between. They shall keep their heads trimmed. And I would say, when they say heads, they don't just mean the top of your head, they mean your beard as well. So there are very specific markers for the priests for holiness. So much so, this hair thing is so much a big deal that the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, he was required to get a haircut every week. He was required to have a haircut every week. Because what happens if it's his time to serve on Yom Kippur and his hair is disheveled, is messy? He's disqualified from doing the Yom Kippur service. Because of his hair? Yes. Because with greater access comes greater limitation, right? Higher Kedusha is great, but it's also really challenging in some ways. So let's just play around with this hair thing for a little bit. Paul talks about in Corinthians, a passage you will all know, and it goes something like this. Any man who prays with his head covered, what's the rest of it? Dishonors his head. Y'all are not as New Testament-y as I suspected. Anyone who prays with his head covered dishonors his head, right? Any woman who prays with her head uncovered dishonors her husband, right? So I want to propose to you, this is what I believe, but I want to propose it to you because I don't expect you to believe everything I believe, and that's a wonderful thing. is that we are not talking about these at all. What we have read in that Corinthians passage is that Paul is giving an anti-Semitic argument against trying to be Jewish, Judaizing, and he's saying in that one passage, Paul is saying, these are things that I've heard taught, Paul is saying that the rabbis made up head covering. It's just tradition. We don't have to follow any of that stuff. These are all the things that Paul said by saying the thing about a man covering. None of that stuff is in what Paul said. The ironic thing about that passage is that while Paul is writing that passage, you know what he has on his head? A covering. Why? Because it's the uniform. It's what Jews do. Now, there is some evidence that probably not all Jews head covered all the time in the 1st and 2nd century, and that's historically probably accurate. But one of Paul's core tenets in all of his writing, and again, I don't claim to be a Pauline scholar. I really don't even like him a lot of the time, to be frank. But I'm cozying back up. But one of Paul's core tenets is that through Yeshua Messiah, a great miracle has happened. That those of you that were far off from God, i.e. Gentiles, nations, and again, Gentile is not a dirty word, it's just you're not Israel. Anybody who was not Israel, now you have free and open access to come and join in the covenant and the family and to be a part of what God intended through Israel. Now you are a part of it, which is what the prophets spoke of, that the nations would come. Through Yeshua, now you have access to be a part. And not only that, in Paul's theology, because of that, you weren't given the Torah. You weren't given the commandments. You don't know how to be a part of this life. But Paul, in a really ironic twist, sees Gentile believers in Yeshua and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He sees them as priests. And if we would understand, we teach the priesthood of all believers. That's a very Southern Baptist thing. Priesthood of all believers. And we've never studied the priesthood. If we would have studied the priesthood, we would have read those verses where Paul and Peter are talking about us as priests and going, wait, something doesn't make sense. Because I am disqualified from being a priest. And it's not because I'm a Gentile. Most Israelites weren't qualified to be priests. So it's not a slam against, well, you're of the nations. You can. It's not that. It's that priesthood is very specific. So what are some other things that Paul could be possibly challenging the new believers with? Let me propose this. Gentile believers, the nations were coming into the Kahal Israel, the family of Israel. They were going to be rejected because just last week they were sacrificing pigs and eating pigs and engaged in temple prostitution and all this idolatry and fornication and all this other thing, which to us is like, oh my God, it's so bad. To them it's just the way the world was. But it's not the way Israel was. And as they were coming in, you could imagine Israel being like, you guys don't understand. You're transgressing holy space and you're filthy. You know, kind of like when some of us sat in church and those people walked in and we couldn't believe that they were there because they still smelled like Boone's Farm or, whatever, Marlboro Reds, or maybe they shot up in the parking lot and we knew they did and they came in anyway. What are they doing here? See, it's just the same thing. It's the same thing over and over and over because humanity is humanity. But Paul understood, listen, you guys are not going to be accepted. How did he know that? Because he was one of the people that didn't accept them for a long time and actually actively chased after them to destroy them. So he goes, you're priests, knowing that they would never be able to enter the holy court. Paul knew this. He wasn't stupid. What could he mean? May I propose that he meant, I want you guys to carry the Kedusha of a priest, which means act like one. Even though you're not one, act like one. In your morals, in the way you carry yourself, in the reverence that you have for God and His holy place and His holy people. Act like a priest, even though you never will get the chance to serve as one, live as one. And that way your testimony before Israel will be one who understands holiness and is willing to do what it takes to conform to the standards that God has asked of His people. Does that make sense? And so, part of that is not about don't wear a kippah. It's part about, you know what, if you're a man, don't have hair like a woman. And if you're a woman, don't have hair like a man. Keep this, because in Paul's mind, in Peter's minds, they know what the priest looks like and they know what the requirements are for the priest. And so it's a cultural way of them triggering a response of Kedusha and holiness in the minds of their hearers and in their readers. And you can say, well, yeah, but they're talking to pagans who don't know anything about the Israelite temple. But the pagans have their own temples. Again, temples in the old world are like churches are to us. You might have 15 and they might all be different, but they're all basically the same. You have an inner sanctum, you have a staff called priests or whatever you call them, and those priests have requirements, right? You can go to any church and you might hear different stuff and it might feel weird, but it's going to be structurally very similar between those things. In the temple, it was the same way. So whether Paul's talking to Israelites or he's talking to pagans, they understand sanctity. They understand requirement. They understand that their pagan priests have a different set of rules to live by than even they do. And so Paul is making, in my opinion, or one option of an opinion, is he's making a call for the Gentiles to live above where they're asked to as a witness to their new Jewish family. It's a marker of Kedusha. It's a marker. So, how does this apply for us? Well, I want to ask you to be very pragmatic in thinking about this and in your inventory, your self-analysis. If you're reading the book Atomic Habits, what James Clear calls a habit scorecard, if you're doing those things, which I hope you are, you've hopefully established where you are, who you are to a pretty decent degree. You've gotten some feedback from someone else, hopefully, to kind of tell you, where you are and how you're doing. You have established some goals as to where you want to be. You found some people maybe that you can emulate that can help get you to that place. Now, it's time to start putting into practice these markers. Part of what we're going to do when Kyle and I begin to team up and teach this stuff is the observance itself is going to be a marker. In other words, one of the ways that we observe Shabbat is that we light candles and we say Kiddush. That is a marker. If you don't have that, if you don't do that, how are you marking? Because see, you're crossing over into a place where you have to know where you are. And so I want you this week to think about what are some markers you've placed in your life. Some really practical ones can be like, well, I notice when I'm around a certain group of people, my Kedusha really dives. I get really lackadaisical. My mouth gets away from me. My whatever. I have those things. I get around certain people and I'm like, I don't have to be so controlled about what I say and how I talk and all that kind of stuff. And maybe that's not a good thing. So maybe those people should, instead of just being a group of people I get around, they might be a marker for me. Not from common to holy, but from holy to common. They should be a marker of where I don't cross from where I know how I should act into degradation. Does that make sense? Not to mean that I don't associate with them or cut them off or whatever, but I know for me, that's a marker for me. I know what happens when I get around them, right? And it decreases my Kedusha that I know I'm responsible for. So that's just one example. There may be places you go that make you feel a different way and make you want to slide. There may be times, seasons. I'm going to say times of the month, and I don't mean that as a shot towards you ladies, because guys have their times of the month too. But we all have cycles during the month, during the year. We have times where maybe you had a tragedy in your background, and every time around that time of year, it really starts to mess with you, and maybe life gets kind of out of your control, and just different things that happen. There are markers around all the time. And I want you to try to start to see those markers as markers of Kedusha, where it causes you where you need to notice, do I need to step up here? Do I need to step away here? What needs to happen, right? So again, next week we're going to start on, we're going to go back to some practical things before we get back into Shabbat and actually going through the commandments, through the halakha, and through the observances. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's been interesting. If you have any questions about this, let me know. If this piques your interest in the temple stuff and you're like, I really kind of enjoyed it, but I was lost, then Wednesday night you need to connect with the Wednesday night group because it's really good for fleshing this stuff out. Amen?